Captain Jake Morrison walked through the massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber for what he knew would be the last time. The enormous room stretched out before him like a cathedral made of crystal and steel, with thousands of alien delegates, sitting in their species-specific sections. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert the babel of alien languages into something resembling coherent discussion. Jake had been coming to these meetings for 15 years, now ever since he was promoted to Earth's primary diplomatic liaison. He had watched human proposals get shot down, human innovations get stolen, and human sacrifices get ignored by species who thought they were better than the upstart primates from Sol System. Today was different, though. Today he carried humanity's final message. The Zephyrian Prime Speaker, a towering blue-skinned humanoid with 4 arms and eyes like black pearls, gestured dismissively as Jake approached the central podium. "The human representative may speak," the alien said in a tone that suggested Jake was wasting everyone's time. "Though I fail to see what new complaints Terra might have that we have not already addressed." Jake almost laughed at that. Addressed? The only thing the Council had addressed was finding new ways to exploit Earth's generosity. He activated his personal recording device and began speaking in a clear, steady voice that carried across the vast chamber. 312 years ago, humanity joined the Galactic Council as junior members. We were told we would be partners in building a better universe. We believed you. Jake paused, letting his words sink in. We were wrong. A ripple of annoyance passed through the alien delegates. The insectoid Vex Empire representatives clicked their mandibles in irritation, while the crystalline beings of the collective hummed in frequencies that hurt human ears. Jake continued without pause. For over 3 centuries, Earth has provided the backbone of galactic civilization. When the Vex wanted to expand into the Outer Rim, who designed the terraforming equipment? Humans, when the crystalline collective needed new mining techniques that would not destroy entire worlds, who developed them? Humans, when the Zephyrian Empire faced rebellion in their outer provinces, who provided the diplomatic framework that prevented a civil war? Humans, Admiral. Lisa Grant sat in the human section, watching Jake deliver the speech they had all helped write. She remembered the day 15 years ago when she had warned this same council about pushing humanity too far. The aliens had laughed then, just as they were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats now. In return for our contributions, we have been treated as servants, Jake continued. Our colonies are taxed to fund wars we never voted for. Our trade ships are conscripted for conflicts that have nothing to do with human interests. Our soldiers die protecting worlds that call us primitive behind our backs. The Arion trade representative, a graceful being that looked like a cross between a bird and a jellyfish, floated forward. The human speaks of sacrifice as if other species do not also contribute to the common good. Jake turned to face the floating alien directly. Last month, the Council voted to increase military quotas by 30%. The Vex Empire vote was counted. The Zephyrian Empire vote was counted. The Crystalline Collective vote was counted. Earth's vote was dismissed because we are considered a minor species. Yet 70% of the ships enforcing that decision carry human technology, human officers, or both. Commander Ryan Blake watched from the communications booth as Jake's words were broadcast across every human world simultaneously. On Mars, on the asteroid mining stations, on the frontier colonies, humans were hearing their representative finally say what they had all been thinking for decades. The final insult came 3 weeks ago, Jake said, his voice growing harder. The Council voted to strip Earth of our voting rights entirely, claiming that a single planet cannot represent the complexity of galactic governance. In the same session, you voted to increase Earth's mandatory contributions to the Galactic Defense Fund by 40%. The Zephyrian Prime Speaker raised one of his 4 hands. The human misrepresents the Council's decision. Earth maintains advisory status and consultative privileges. Consultative privileges, Jake repeated slowly. The right to give advice that you will ignore while demanding we pay for the consequences of ignoring it. He looked around the chamber at the thousands of alien faces staring back at him. You want our technology but not our opinions? You want our soldiers but not our strategies? You want our resources but not our representation? Dr. Amy Carter had designed most of the quantum communication arrays that allowed this very meeting to take place, with delegates scattered across dozens of star systems participating in real time. She had spent 40 years of her life perfecting the technology that held galactic civilization together, and she had watched alien species take credit for her work time and again. For 3 centuries, humanity has been the glue holding this council together, Jake continued. When the Vex and the Zephyrians were ready to go to war over territorial disputes, human diplomats found the compromise. When the Crystalline Collective hoarded rare minerals while outer worlds starved, human trade negotiators created the resource-sharing protocols that prevent famines. When alien species could not understand each other's psychology well enough to cooperate, humans served as translators, mediators, and bridge builders. The chamber had grown quiet now. Even the usual background chatter of translation devices had faded to a whisper. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim datapad containing humanity's formal response to the Council's latest demands. You have made it clear that you see humans as useful servants rather than equal partners. You take our contributions for granted while treating us with contempt. You exploit our desire for peaceful cooperation while giving nothing meaningful in return. Jake held up the datapad. Effective immediately, humanity withdraws from the Galactic Council. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, alien voices began rising in protest, confusion, and dismissal. The Vex delegate clicked angrily. The humans cannot simply leave. They have obligations, responsibilities. Jake smiled for the first time since entering the chamber. Yes, we do have responsibilities to ourselves, to our children, to our future. We have spent 3 centuries sacrificing those responsibilities to serve yours. He placed the datapad on the central podium. No more, the Crystalline Collective's representative chimed in harmonics that translated roughly to laughter. One primitive species cannot threaten galactic civilization. There are thousands of worlds, hundreds of species. You overestimate your importance. Commander Ryan Blake had been waiting for exactly that response. He activated the broadcast system that would carry Jake's final words to every corner of human space. Jake looked directly into the recording devices and spoke with quiet certainty. Perhaps. You are right. Perhaps humanity's contributions have been insignificant. Perhaps galactic civilization is strong enough to continue without us. Jake turned and began walking toward the chamber doors. I guess we will all find out together. As Jake left the council chamber, Admiral Lisa Grant and the rest of the human delegation followed him. Behind them, alien voices rose in a cacophony of anger, confusion, and growing concern. For the first time in 3 centuries, they were about to discover what the galaxy looked like without humans holding it together. Dr. Amy Carter stood in the Quantum Communications Control Center on Luna Station, watching her life's work begin to fail across the galaxy. The massive holographic display showed communication networks that had connected thousands of worlds for over 2 centuries starting to flicker and die. Red warning lights appeared on star system after star system as the quantum entanglement arrays lost synchronization. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Morrison had delivered humanity's withdrawal notice to the Galactic Council. 3 weeks since Admiral Lisa Grant had recalled every human engineer, technician, and maintenance specialist from alien worlds. The aliens had laughed at first, claiming that any species could maintain technology once it was built. They were learning how wrong they had been. Amy touched a control panel and zoomed in on the Vex Empire's primary communication hub in the Kepler sector. The readings showed cascade failures spreading through their entire network. The insectoid. Aliens had always been brilliant at copying existing technology, but they had never understood the underlying quantum consciousness principles that made the communication arrays work. Without human operators who could interface directly with the quantum fields, their networks were shutting down one by one. Commander Tony Williams received the first distress call from a Zephyrian outpost 3 days after the communication failures began. The blue-skinned aliens were panicking because they could no longer coordinate their massive empire across dozens of star systems. For 3 centuries, they had relied on human-designed networks that allowed instant communication across galactic distances. Now their messages were taking weeks or months to travel between worlds. Assuming they arrived at all, the Zephyrian commander's voice crackled through the failing transmission, filled with barely controlled panic. "Human vessel, we require immediate assistance with our communication systems. Our engineers cannot restore function to the quantum arrays." Tony looked at his communications officer, Lieutenant Sarah Davis, who shook her head grimly. They both knew exactly why the Zephyrian systems were failing. The quantum entanglement networks required constant micro-adjustments that only human consciousness could perform. Other species could use the technology, but they could never truly maintain it because they lacked the unique neural patterns that allowed humans to perceive quantum states directly. "Negative, Zephyrian vessel," Tony replied. "All human technical support has been withdrawn as per the Council's decision to exclude Earth from galactic governance. You will need to find alternative solutions." The silence that followed spoke volumes. The Zephyrians had spent generations mocking human technical abilities, claiming that their own science was far superior. They had never bothered to learn how their communication systems actually worked, content to let human technicians handle the complex maintenance while taking credit for the technology. Colonel Beth Rogers watched from Earth's orbital defense stations as the first military disasters began unfolding across the galaxy. The Vex Empire had launched their long-planned invasion of the Helix sector, expecting an easy conquest of the peaceful farming worlds. What they found instead was chaos beyond their worst nightmares. The defensive arrays that humans had installed and maintained around the Helix colonies went offline within hours of the invasion beginning. The Vex commanders had assumed that defensive technology would continue functioning automatically, but they had never understood that the systems required human intuition to adapt to changing battle conditions. Without human tactical officers to coordinate the defense, the automated systems simply shut down when faced with situations they had not been specifically programmed to handle. Beth received fragmentary reports from the scattered human civilians who had managed to escape the Helix sector before the invasion began. The Vex forces had expected to face organized resistance from the planetary defense fleets, but instead found themselves fighting individual ships that could not communicate with each other or coordinate their movements. The result was not the easy victory the Vex had planned, but a chaotic free-for-all that was devastating both attackers and defenders. Dr. Kate Phillips monitored the medical crisis that was spreading through the overcrowded refugee stations scattered across the galaxy. For centuries, she had developed the protocols that allowed dozens of different species to live and work together safely. Her research had identified the thousands of potential biological incompatibilities between different alien races and created the medical frameworks that prevented disease outbreaks in multi-species communities without her continued oversight. And the human medical corps that had been trained in her techniques. A plague was sweeping through the stations where refugees from the Helix invasion had gathered. Species that had lived peacefully together for generations were suddenly dying from diseases that their immune systems could not handle. The aliens had taken the absence of interspecies medical problems for granted, never realizing that human doctors and researchers were working around the clock to prevent exactly these kinds of outbreaks. The crystalline collective's mining operations in the Tau sector ground to a complete halt when their extraction equipment began malfunctioning. Engineer Mike Thompson had designed the mineral extraction systems that allowed the collective to harvest rare elements without destroying entire planets. But the crystalline beings had never learned the delicate balance required to operate the machinery safely. Without human oversight, the extraction process became increasingly unstable. Several mining platforms exploded when the collective's operators tried to increase production beyond the safety limits that Mike had built into the systems. The crystalline aliens discovered too late that human engineering was not just about building machines that worked, but building machines that worked safely and efficiently over long periods of time. Admiral Lisa Grant compiled reports from across human space as the scope of the galactic crisis became clear. The Arion trade fleets, those graceful ships that had carried goods between star systems for centuries, were stranded throughout the galaxy as their navigation systems failed. The humans had provided the stellar cartography that allowed the Arians to navigate safely through the complex gravitational fields near galactic center, but without continuous updates from human survey teams, their maps were becoming dangerously obsolete. Financial markets across the galaxy crashed as the galactic credit system collapsed. The currency had been stable for over 2 centuries because it was backed by human economic models that accounted for the psychological and cultural differences between species. Without human economists to maintain the complex algorithms that kept the multi-species economy functioning, trade agreements fell apart and entire sectors found themselves unable to conduct business. Captain Susan Adams watched from the bridge of the Earth defense ship Liberty as desperate alien vessels began appearing at the edge of human space. These were not invasion fleets or military expeditions, but refugee ships filled with beings whose worlds had descended into chaos. Without the stabilizing presence of human technology and expertise, the proud Zephyrian Empire was fragmenting as their constituent species declared independence or open rebellion. Without human diplomatic frameworks to manage interspecies tensions, the empire that had dominated a quarter of the galaxy for millennia was tearing itself apart in civil war. The Vex expansion had stalled as their own worlds fell into disorder, their rigid command structure unable to adapt to the fluid situations that human flexibility had always managed effortlessly. Susan knew that similar reports were coming in from every sector of the galaxy. The universe that had dismissed humanity as primitive and expendable was discovering just how dependent they had become on the species they had taken for granted. The collapse was accelerating, and there was no sign that any of the alien civilizations had the knowledge or capability to stop it. The galaxy was learning what happened when the keystone species simply walked away. General Nick Davis read through the intelligence reports flowing into Earth Command with growing amazement at how quickly galactic civilization was unraveling. 2 months had passed since humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, and the cascade of failures was accelerating beyond anyone's predictions. What had started as technical problems and communication breakdowns was now spiraling into complete societal collapse across dozens of star systems. The crystalline collective's homeworlds were experiencing their first famines in over 1,000 years. The mineral beings had always been efficient at extracting resources from dead planets, but they had never learned how to grow food or manage agricultural systems. For centuries, they had traded rare metals for food produced by other species, relying on human agricultural specialists to optimize crop yields on the farming worlds that fed half the galaxy. Dr. Matt Lewis had spent 30 years developing the agricultural systems that turned barren planets into garden worlds capable of feeding billions. His work had created the foundation for galactic food security, allowing species to specialize in what they did best while trading for what they needed. Without his continued research and the human agricultural teams that maintained the farming systems, crop yields were plummeting everywhere. The automated farming platforms orbiting the agricultural worlds of the Kepler sector had shut down completely when their biological monitoring systems failed. The aliens who had taken over the platforms after the human withdrawal discovered that growing food required more than just planting seeds and adding water. The delicate balance of nutrients, soil, bacteria, and environmental conditions that human farmers had maintained for generations was collapsing, leaving entire worlds facing starvation. Commander Kelly Mason received desperate transmissions from the outer rim colonies as their planetary governors pleaded for emergency food supplies. These worlds had been settled by various alien species over the past century, but they had all relied on human agricultural technology and expertise to make their harsh environments livable. Without human support, the terraforming systems were breaking down and the colonists were abandoning their settlements to become refugees. The Arion trade fleets that had once carried food between star systems were mostly grounded now, their elegant ships stranded in port with navigation systems that no longer functioned properly. The graceful beings had always prided themselves on their merchant skills, but they had never realized that their ability to trade across the galaxy depended entirely on human, stellar cartography and navigation technology. Captain Lover Bennett led a reconnaissance mission to the former trade hub at Alpha Centauri B, where the Aryans had maintained their largest commercial station for over 2 centuries. What she found was a ghost station with only a skeleton crew still aboard. The massive cargo bays that had once bustled with trade goods from across the galaxy now sat empty, their automated systems shut down and their trade computers displaying error messages in a dozen alien languages. The Aryan station commander, a being that resembled a floating jellyfish with rainbow-colored tendrils, approached Laura's ship with obvious desperation. Its translated voice carried a tone of panic that cut through the usual musical quality of Aryan speech. "Human Captain, we require immediate assistance with our trade systems. Our commercial networks have collapsed and we cannot process transactions between species." Lavra studied the elegant alien through her view screen, remembering the days when Aryan traders had been welcomed on human worlds as honored guests and valuable partners. Those same traders had voted to support stripping Earth of its council voting rights, claiming that primitive species should not have equal say in galactic commerce. Now they were begging for help from the primitives they had dismissed. "I am sorry, but all human technical support has been withdrawn from alien operations," Lavra replied formally. "Earth no longer provides assistance to species that do not recognize our right to equal representation in galactic affairs." The banking crisis was spreading to every corner of inhabited space as the galactic credit system completely collapsed. Senator Paul Jenkins reviewed the economic reports coming in from human intelligence services with a mixture of sadness and bitter satisfaction. The multi-species currency had seemed so stable for so long that most aliens had forgotten it required constant management to prevent runaway inflation or deflation. Human economists had spent decades developing the complex algorithms that balance the economic needs of species with completely different concepts of value, time, and trade. The crystalline collective measured wealth in terms of mineral purity and crystal formation patterns. The Vex Empire valued productivity and expansion above all else. The Zephyrians cared most about social status and hierarchy. Human economists had created a currency system that could translate between these different value systems. But without their continued oversight, the system was collapsing into chaos. Dr. Patricia Wells monitored the medical catastrophe spreading through the galaxy. As species that had lived together peacefully for centuries began dying from diseases that had been controlled for generations, the multi-species medical protocols she had developed were failing without human doctors to maintain them. And new plagues were emerging from the refugee camps where different species were mixing without proper medical screening. The worst outbreak was on the former council station at Galactic Center, where representatives from dozens of species had lived and worked together for centuries. The station's medical systems had been designed to prevent cross-species contamination, but they required human medical officers to operate the complex biological filters and quarantine protocols. Without human oversight, a respiratory infection that was harmless to Zephyrians had mutated and begun killing Vex workers in large numbers. The Vex Empire's expansion into the Helix sector had turned into a complete disaster as their invasion forces found themselves fighting not just the local defenders but also each other. The insectoid aliens had always relied on rigid command structures and precise coordination to win their battles. But their communication systems were so degraded that different Vex fleets were attacking each other by mistake. Admiral Bobby Ross monitored the situation from Earth's deep space listening posts, watching as the once mighty Vex military machine tore itself apart through friendly fire incidents and coordination failures. The aliens had always mocked human military tactics as too flexible and unpredictable, preferring their own systematic approach to warfare. They were learning too late that flexibility was exactly what military forces needed when their command and control systems failed. The psychological impact of the collapse was becoming as devastating as the practical problems. Species that had considered themselves superior to humans for centuries were now facing the reality that their entire civilization had been built on human foundations. The proud Zephyrians were discovering that their empire had only held together because human diplomats had spent generations managing the cultural and political tensions between their subject species. Commander Ryan Blake intercept alien communications filled with growing desperation and panic as the scope of the crisis became clear to galactic leaders. The aliens were finally beginning to understand what humans had been trying to tell them for decades. Galactic civilization was not a collection of independent species working together, but a complex interdependent system that required careful management and coordination to function. Without the species that had provided that management and coordination for 3 centuries, the system was falling apart faster than anyone could have imagined. The universe was learning that some species were more equal than others, and that dismissing the keystone species as expendable had consequences that reached far beyond anyone's expectations. President Danny Turner stood in the Oval Office on Earth, looking out at the night sky that now held secrets the rest of the galaxy was only beginning to understand. 6 months had passed since humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, and the reports coming in from across known space painted a picture of collapse so complete that even Earth's military analysts were struggling to believe the data. The first alien delegation to reach Earth arrived 3 days ago, not in the grand warships that had once intimidated human colonies, but in converted cargo ships filled with refugees and desperate diplomats. Captain Susan Adams had intercepted them at the edge of the solar system, her orders clear and unwavering. No alien vessel would be permitted to approach Earth without explicit permission from the Global Assembly. The lead ship carried a delegation of Zephyrian nobles, beings who 6 months ago had voted to strip humanity of its council representation, while demanding increased human contributions to their empire's defense budget. Now they floated in space beyond Pluto, sending increasingly desperate messages about the complete breakdown of their civilization. Admiral Bobby Ross played the latest transmission for the president and his cabinet. The Zephyrian speaker's voice, usually so proud and commanding, now carried notes of panic that the translation software struggled to convey. Honored human leaders, the Zephyrian Empire formally requests emergency assistance to restore order to our territories. We are prepared to offer significant compensation for human expertise in communication systems, agricultural management, and diplomatic coordination. President Turner listened to the message with the same expression he might have worn while watching a documentary about ancient history. The Zephyrians were offering to pay for services that humans had provided freely for 3 centuries, services that the aliens had taken for granted while treating their providers with contempt and dismissal. Dr. Kate Phillips had compiled a medical analysis of the galactic collapse that made for sobering reading. Entire species were going extinct, not through war or natural disaster, but through the simple breakdown of the medical systems that had kept them alive in multi-species environments. The elegant Arion traders were dying from respiratory infections that had been easily preventable with human medical protocols. The insectoid Vex were suffering from genetic degradation as their carefully managed breeding programs collapsed without human biological expertise. The crystalline collective had lost 3 entire worlds to industrial accidents as their mining operations spiraled out of control without human safety oversight. The mineral beings had always been excellent at extracting resources, but they had never learned the careful balance between efficiency and safety that human engineers had maintained for generations. Without that balance, their mining platforms were suffering cascade failures that destroyed entire planetary systems. Captain Lavra Bennett led survey missions to the edges of what had once been thriving galactic trade routes, finding nothing but debris fields and abandoned stations. The great merchant fleets that had carried goods between 1,000 worlds were mostly destroyed or stranded, their crews dead or scattered as refugees. The economic networks that had supported galactic civilization for centuries had collapsed so completely that most surviving aliens had reverted to subsistence, living on whatever resources they could find locally. The Vex Empire's expansion into The Helix sector had turned into something that military historians would study for generations as an example of how quickly organized forces could destroy themselves. The insectoid aliens had always prided themselves on their systematic approach to conquest. But without human coordination systems, their invasion fleets had devolved into chaotic battles between different Vex factions who could no longer communicate effectively with each other. Commander Kelly Mason intercepted Vex military communications that revealed the true scope of their disaster. The species that had once conquered dozens of star systems through disciplined military organization was now fighting a three-way civil war as different hive groups competed for the remaining resources of their collapsing empire. The rigid command structure that had made them so effective when supported by human technology had become a fatal weakness when that technology was withdrawn. Engineer Chris Taylor worked around the clock to remove every trace of human technology from systems that other species might try to salvage. The decision had been made at the highest levels of Earth's government that if the galaxy wanted to exist without humanity, it would do so without any benefit from human innovation. Every piece of human-designed technology was being systematically shut down, recalled, or destroyed to prevent other species from reverse engineering solutions to their problems. The task was enormous because human technology had become so integrated into galactic infrastructure that removing it was like pulling the foundation stones from a building. Communication networks, transportation systems, medical equipment, agricultural platforms, mining operations, and defensive arrays all contained human components that other species had never bothered to understand or replicate. Dr. Amy Carter supervised the shutdown of the quantum communication networks that had connected the galaxy for centuries. Her life's work was being methodically destroyed to prevent alien species from benefiting from technology they had never appreciated. The irony was not lost on her that the aliens were now desperately trying to repair systems they had dismissed as primitive human engineering. Just months before, Senator Paul Jenkins read aloud in the Global Assembly the latest requests for assistance from alien governments. The proud species that had once looked down on humanity as useful but inferior partners were now offering territorial concessions, trade privileges, and political recognition in exchange for human technical support. The desperation in their messages was obvious to everyone who heard them. The most pathetic requests came from the former Galactic Council itself, the governing body that had voted to exclude Earth from meaningful participation in galactic affairs. The remaining council members were offering to restore humanity's voting rights, grant Earth permanent Security Council status, and provide territorial guarantees for human colonies if only human experts would return to help restore basic services. To the surviving worlds, President Turner had a simple response to all these offers: too little, too late. Humanity had spent 3 centuries trying to build a cooperative galactic civilization based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. The aliens had chosen exploitation and dismissal instead of partnership. Now they were learning the consequences of that choice. The reports from across the galaxy painted a clear picture of what happened when a keystone species was removed from an interdependent system. Ancient civilizations that had existed for millennia before humans ever reached the stars were collapsing, not because they lacked the knowledge to survive, but because they had become so dependent on human expertise that they could no longer function without it. The Zephyrian Empire was fragmenting into dozens of smaller kingdoms as their subject species declared independence without human diplomatic frameworks to manage the transition peacefully. The Crystalline Collective was facing resource wars as their mining operations failed and they fought over the remaining stockpiles of rare minerals. The Arion trade networks had collapsed so completely that former merchant princes were reduced to scavenging abandoned cargo for basic survival supplies. Commander Ryan Blake compiled the final intelligence summary that would guide Earth's policy for the foreseeable future. The galaxy that had dismissed humanity as expendable was now a collection of scattered survivors clinging to the wreckage of their former glory. The universe had chosen to treat humans as servants rather than partners, and the universe was now learning to exist without the servants it had taken for granted. In the silence between the stars where once the chatter of 1,000 civilizations had filled the void, only Earth signals remained to mark the passage of a species that had tried to lift up the galaxy and, when rejected, had simply let it fall. Captain LeVar Bennett piloted her exploration ship through what had once been the bustling trade hub of the Andromeda sector, now finding nothing but dead space stations and drifting debris fields. 5 years had passed since Earth withdrew from the Galactic Council, and the galaxy bore no resemblance to the thriving civilization that had once spanned thousands of worlds and hundreds of species. The massive Zephyrian trade station that had once processed cargo from 50 different star systems now tumbled slowly through space, its hull breached in dozens of places and its corridors dark and airless. Laura's sensors detected no life signs aboard the kilometer-long structure that had housed over 1 million beings just a few years ago. The proud blue-skinned aliens who had once ruled a quarter of the galaxy were now scattered refugees struggling to survive on whatever worlds could still support basic life. Admiral Bobby Ross reviewed the long-range survey reports from across known space with a mixture of sadness and grim satisfaction. The species that had dismissed humanity as primitive upstarts had proven incapable of maintaining even the most basic functions of civilization without human support. Ancient races that had existed for millions of years had collapsed in less than a decade simply because they had become too dependent on the innovations and expertise of the supposedly inferior humans. The crystalline collective had reverted to their pre-spaceflight existence, mining resources on their home worlds with primitive tools after their advanced extraction technology failed beyond repair. The elegant creatures who had once manipulated matter at the molecular level were now chipping minerals from cave walls like their ancestors had done eons before joining galactic civilization. Their vast knowledge of physics and chemistry had proven useless without the human engineers who had translated that knowledge into practical applications. Dr. Patricia Wells completed her historical analysis of the galactic collapse, documenting how the greatest multi-species civilization in the universe's recorded history had crumbled in just 5 years. Her research painted a clear picture of what happened when a keystone species was removed from an interdependent system that had evolved over centuries to rely on their unique contributions. The data was staggering in its implications. Over 3,000 worlds that had supported intelligent life were now either completely abandoned or reduced to subsistence-level populations. Hundreds of species had gone extinct not through war or natural disaster, but through the simple inability to maintain the technological and social systems that had kept them alive in a complex galactic environment. Commander Ryan Blake monitored the few surviving alien communities from Earth's deep space listening posts, tracking the scattered remnants of civilizations that had once commanded fleets of starships and controlled the resources of entire star systems. The insectoid Vex had devolved into tribal warfare as different hive groups competed for the remaining scraps of their collapsed empire. Their rigid social structure that had once enabled them to coordinate massive construction projects and military campaigns had become a fatal weakness. When the communication systems that held it together failed, the Arion trade fleets that had once carried goods between distant worlds were now mostly grounded on whatever planets their crews could reach before their ships broke down completely. The graceful beings who had prided themselves on their merchant skills were learning to farm and hunt like primitive settlers, their sophisticated understanding of galactic economics useless in a universe where there was no longer any meaningful trade between worlds. Captain Susan Adams commanded the defense perimeter around human space, turning away the occasional alien vessel that still tried to approach Earth seeking assistance or refuge. The proud species that had once looked down on humanity were now reduced to begging at the borders of the civilization they had rejected. Each alien ship that limped to the edge of the solar system carried the same desperate message: please help. U.S. rebuild what we have lost. President Danny Turner had authorized a standard response to all such requests, delivered with the same cold formality that the aliens had once used when dismissing human concerns. Earth would consider providing humanitarian assistance to alien refugees who formally acknowledged human superiority in technological, diplomatic, and administrative matters. The response was calculated to wound the pride of species who had spent centuries insisting on their own superiority over primitive humans. Very few aliens accepted those terms. Most chose to drift away into the darkness between stars rather than admit that the species they had dismissed as lucky primitives had actually been the architects of their entire civilization. Their pride was literally killing them, but it was a pride they seemed unable to abandon even in the face of extinction. Engineer Chris Taylor put the finishing touches on Project Tabula Rasa, the systematic removal of every trace of human technology from the ruins of galactic civilization. Human survey teams had spent years traveling to abandoned stations in dead worlds, collecting or destroying any equipment that might have been reverse-engineered by surviving alien populations. If the galaxy wanted to exist without humanity, it would do so without any benefit from human innovation. The project had revealed just how completely human technology had penetrated every aspect of galactic infrastructure. Communication systems, transportation networks, medical equipment, agricultural platforms, mining operations, defensive arrays, and even basic life support systems all contained human components that other species had never bothered to understand. Removing those components was like performing surgery to extract every major organ from a living body. Dr. Matt Lewis reviewed the final reports from the abandoned agricultural worlds that had once fed billions of beings across dozens of star systems. The automated farming platforms that had turned barren planets into garden worlds were now silent and still, their crops withered and their soil returning to desert. The aliens had never learned that growing food required more than just advanced technology. It required an understanding of biological systems that only humans seemed to possess. The irony was not lost on any of the human observers that the species who had called humans primitive had proven incapable of performing the most basic task of any civilization, feeding themselves. Without human agricultural expertise, even the most advanced alien societies had reverted to hunter-gatherer subsistence within a few years. Senator Paul Jenkins delivered the final address to the Global Assembly on the 5th anniversary of humanity's withdrawal from galactic civilization. His words were broadcast across human space but no longer reached any alien ears, since the communication networks that had once connected the galaxy had long since fallen silent. 5 years ago, we offered the Galaxy Partnership and received exploitation in return. We offered our knowledge and received contempt. We offered our protection and received demands for more. Today, we stand alone among the stars, surrounded by the wreckage of civilizations that chose arrogance over cooperation. The senator paused, looking out at the representatives of humanity's thriving colonies and growing population. Human civilization had not just survived the collapse of the galactic community, it had prospered. Freed from the burden of supporting ungrateful alien populations, human resources had been redirected toward exploration, research, and expansion. New colonies were being established, new technologies developed, new frontiers explored. The universe taught us a valuable lesson about the price of being taken for granted. We have learned that lesson well. Humanity will continue to grow and thrive among the stars, but we will do so on our own terms, for our own benefit, and with our own interests as the primary concern. Admiral Lisa Grant watched from the observation deck of Luna Station as human ships departed for new star systems that had been cleared of alien presence. The galaxy was vast and mostly empty now, with plenty of room for a species that had proven it could not only survive but excel, without the burden of supporting those who saw cooperation as weakness and generosity as stupidity. In the silence between the stars, where once the voices of 1,000 civilizations had filled the void with the noise of galactic society, only human signals now marked the passage of a species that had learned the hard way that some partnerships were not worth maintaining. The universe had chosen to treat humanity as expendable servants rather than valued partners, and the universe had discovered too late that it could not function without the servants it had dismissed.